In this video, all we're going to be looking at today is the molecule ATP, your body's energy molecule. All life processes require energy, be it making new proteins or lipids to active transport. All of our life process requires some kind of energy. Our cells will use energy stored in chemical bonds of macromolecules. Our bodies use chemical potential energy. Chemical potential energy, as you may recall from physical science, is energy stored in chemical bonds. Macromolecules like carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins contain a large number of chemical bonds, so they have a large amount of energy stored within them. Adenosine triphosphate, ATP, is the compound that's used by our cells to store and release energy. So while we eat carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins, our body does not use the energy in those substances directly. Our bodies must convert those three things into glucose. Then our bodies will use that glucose to make ATP. ATP is the only compound that our cells use for energy. ATP transfers energy from macromolecules, again, carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins, to the cell in order to run its life processes like active transport. Cells must obtain and use energy in order to function. All living things have three general criteria that they must meet in order to be classified as living. They have to have genetic information, they have to consume energy, and they have to be able to reproduce on their own. Cells, because they are alive, must consume energy. ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is the compound that's used to store and release energy in cells. ATP is made of three parts, and the structure of ATP is almost identical to nucleotides. ATP is a nucleic acid. It has basically the same three parts: a nitrogenous base. Remember from our discussion of macromolecules and looking at nucleic acids, there were 5 different nitrogenous bases. The one that we find in ATP is adenine. The nitrogenous base is attached to a 5-carbon sugar called ribose. And then connected to the other side of that ribose is a phosphate group. The difference between ATP and a nucleotide is the number of phosphate groups. In the nucleotide, there was only 1 phosphate group. In ATP, there's 3. Triphosphate. There are 3 phosphate groups in an ATP molecule. Structurally, it looks very similar to what our illustrations of a nucleotide look like, except over here on the right-hand side. Nucleotide only has 1 phosphate group, whereas ATP has 3. Everything else about it's the same. Here it is in a more chemistry kind of view, where we can see all the different elements that are in it. Made of the 5 big elements for life. We have carbon in there, though you can't really see it. Carbon's wherever there is an intersect in any of these circles, there would be a carbon there. Hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, and phosphorus, all 5. And again, remember, nucleic acids are the only ones that would have all 5 of those elements in them all the time. So let's talk about storing and releasing energy. We start with adenosine diphosphate, di meaning 2. Looks exactly like ATP, but with only 2 phosphate groups instead of 3. Cells store energy by adding a 3rd phosphate group to ATP, changing it from ADP to ATP. So basically, again, you start off with ADP, D meaning di, it has 2 phosphate groups. And we take another third phosphate group and we add it to it. We make an extra phosphate-phosphate bond, an extra bond between the second and the third phosphate. And it is that bond that stores the energy in ATP. Cells will release energy by breaking the bond between the second and third phosphate group. So whenever a cell needs energy, it breaks off that third phosphate, the one that is added to ATP to make it ATP. So again, we take this ATP molecule with its 3 phosphates, we break the bond between the second and the third. That new bond that was made gets broken, and when it's broken, energy is released. You need to remember, whenever chemical bonds are made, you store energy. Whenever chemical bonds are broken, you release that energy. Whenever you make bonds, you store energy. Whenever you break bonds, you release it. So chemically speaking, for releasing energy, you start with ATP, triphosphate, 3 P's on the molecule. You break one of those phosphates off, so you'll have a DP, diphosphate, and a separated phosphate group, plus all the energy that's released when that bond is broken for the cell processes to work. When you're trying to store energy, you start with ADP, you add a phosphate group to it, and the energy you store in that new bond will be the energy you get from food, from your carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins that you eat, from the glucose that your cell is fed. The energy from that molecule is what gets stored in that new phosphate bond that makes the ATP. So in summary, living things consume ATP through energy required processes. From our last unit, active transport is one of these energy requiring processes. And they create ATP through energy releasing processes, the burning of glucose, for example. ATP transfers energy between biochemical reactions in the cell. And that's what the next video and next set of notes will be all about. We'll learn about glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, the electron transfer chain, fermentation, etc. ATP transfers energy from these biochemical reactions to the cell, so the cell can use it for its life processes. ATP is the main energy source for cell processes, including protein synthesis, active transport, and muscle contraction, amongst other things. So ATP simply transfers the energy from some biological chemical reactions like glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, electron transfer chain, etc., to the cell so they can use that energy for protein synthesis, active transport, and muscle contraction. We'll end with this summary image. ADP, diphosphate, has 2 phosphate groups on it. It is a low energy molecule. It is an uncharged battery. When we add a third phosphate group to it, we store energy in that bond. It becomes ATP, triphosphate, which is a fully charged energy molecule.